Great. Welcome everyone to this side event or a side event about the UAE and nature-based solutions. And my name is Tanzid Alam. I'm the managing director of Earth Matters Consulting. I'll be your moderator and kind of MC for the day. We have a really interesting lineup of speakers. Um, so I'm not going to give an introduction to the topic or anything. I think we just want to dive straight into it. I appreciate we've joined a bit late. We started a bit late as well. So first we have Meita Al Mansouri. She's the senior manager or section manager of marine assessment and conservation, terrestrial and marine biodiversity with the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi. Welcome, Meita.
Thank you, Tanzid.
Great. We also have Marina Antonopoulou, who's the Director of Nature Conservation with Emirates Nature WWF, longtime friend and old colleague as well. Marina, welcome. We have David Ramos, who's the Senior Manager of Sustainability with HSBC Middle East. He's here, so any questions about money, it's all about him. He always gets that in these events. And then we have, I'm just looking at my notes. Muafaq Al-Kaderi, who is an advisor with GHD Advisory, and he's very knowledgeable about this topic as well. So you'll get to hear from all of them. But I'd like to start with ladies first, which is really important, given it is an inclusive event. So Meita, can you explain a bit more about why this topic is so important?
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to our humble panel discussion. We will be talking a lot about natural-based solutions. And in today's environment, natural-based solutions are is one of the key weapons or tools we have today to combat climate change. And natural-based solutions give us a lot of services, including combating climate change. And this is why we would like to have a full panel just to discuss these issues.
Thank you, Meita. And Marina, a question for you. Can you define what are nature-based solutions for me?
Is it on? Yes, it is. Well, thank you, everyone. I think it's important to start with that question, so thanks, Tanzid, for asking that. So essentially, nature-based solutions are meant to be interventions on the ground that bring measurable achievements in terms of ecosystem management, protection, and restoration. So that's number one, otherwise they wouldn't be nature-based. In addition, this type of interventions, they need to bring solutions for societal challenges. And yes, climate change, of course, is one of the most critical challenges we're facing at the moment. But there are other challenges that they can definitely benefit from nature, such as disaster risk management and reduction, water and food security, and in general, broader socioeconomic benefits and human well-being. So it's not only about climate change, and good quality nature-based solutions projects need to bring those outcomes all together. So nature, climate, and other socioeconomic benefits for communities and society. And a good reference point, I think, for good quality nature-based solutions is the IUCN Global Standard. So that is a standard that any practitioner on this topic could start looking at. There is specific definitions on those societal challenges and guidance documents in terms of what to follow if you want to implement a nature-based solutions project.
Great, thanks, Marina. And we'll dive more into some of this soon as well. Muafaq, if I could ask you the next question. You've been following kind of some of the science around the topic with the IPCC. So I have a question related to that. How are nature and oceans featured in the recent IPCC reports? And what are the top line recommendations for policymakers? You see?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic as well. I think the first thing we should identify as well is who the IPCC is. I know that they're a generally niche body, but effectively when we're here in the climate negotiations, you're going to hear their name quite a lot. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I've been following them for the last few years. Effectively, what they do is they're a body that work together with scientists all across the globe to try to understand how the climate is being impacted in very different regions, and then understand what we can try to do and what are the best solutions we can undertake in order to transition away from climate change. When you're looking at blue carbon and nature-based solutions, I think there's a few reports we definitely want to highlight, and they're the key reports you need to look into. The first one is the special report on Oceans and Cryosphere that was released in 2019. This is the exact report that will give you all the information you need to know about how ecosystems are likely to be impacted by climate change, about how the oceans are changing, chemistry, ecosystems, migration. From this report by itself, you'll have the building blocks and the fundamentals to understand why this is so important. From there, we have 3 general reports that were released in the most recent years, which is primarily from the 6th assessment report. The first is from the Working Group 1's report on the physical science basis. This will tell you exactly how the climate is changing now in terms of sea level rise, changes to oceanic temperature, work along that field. For those who are looking at adaptation, and this is very heavy when you're looking at nature-based solutions, you'll be looking at Working Group 2. And they're focusing a lot more on how you can use nature-based solutions to talk about soil fixation, how you can try to prevent erosion of the soil in the process. And then from there, we look at Working Group 3, which are talking a lot more about mitigation. And we're going to hear more about that in today's discussion as well. But it's how these nature-based solutions, the plantations of mangroves, seagrasses, and everything of the sort can help with sequestration of carbon dioxide. Through this process, if you look at all of them in conjunction, it gives you the general fundamentals of how you can try to take this forward. But the main recommendation from the IPCC is that what we're talking about here is trying to reduce the carbon footprint of the planet. And there are 2 main streams for this. You can do it technologically, or you can do it through the environment. And at the moment, we're not technologically capable of trying to reduce these carbon emissions to the point sufficient for us to reach the 1.5 degree target. So as a result, we really need to invest significantly more when it comes to just the environmental aspects of it. So that means mass plantations, afforestation, reforestation, and putting a heavy focus on just the oceanographic side of things as well, wherever possible.
Great, thank you, Mofak. And you mentioned the word investment, and so that leads nicely to the question today I have for David. So, David, why is HSBC interested in this topic?
Well, we are in this panel because we have a global program that is called the Climate Solutions Partnership, which is $100 million philanthropic money that we are donating to partners, and it covers 3 areas addressing climate change. One is innovation, supporting innovative companies. The other one is supporting energy transition in Asia Pacific specifically, and the third one is nature-based solutions. So particularly in this region, we have 3 projects around nature-based solutions, one in Egypt here, one in the UAE with Emirates Nature, and another one in Turkey with the local partner, the local chapter of WWF International there in Turkey as well. And we're hoping to launch a new project in Bahrain as well very soon. But why is HSBC interested in this? So we have committed as a bank, as an international bank, on being net zero across our finance portfolio by 2050, and this is an extremely challenging target to achieve. First of all, because nobody knows yet how are we going to achieve that, because most of the sectors we bank, they don't have a clear decarbonization pathway. So we need to work with them and advance with them and support them financially to be able to achieve that target so we can achieve our own target. We also know that we cannot reach 1.5 or even 2 degrees if we are not regenerating nature. Well, that's why HSBC at the global level has put a focus on this. We have, from a non-commercial perspective, we have this portfolio of projects, but also we are working from a commercial side with our joint venture with Pollination that we created a couple of years ago that is now called the Climate Asset Management, where we're actually trying to put a price tag on nature or natural assets, so it can actually become an asset class and investors can put money on it.
Excellent. Lots of interesting points you just made there. Hopefully we'll get to kind of pick up on that. But Mehter, I'd like to you to talk to us a bit more about the projects that EAD is doing in Abu Dhabi, focusing on blue carbon and what's the importance of coastal habitats in Abu Dhabi for climate change mitigation and adaptation.
So in the UAE in general, we have laws and regulations that are put in place to protect these what we call blue carbon sinks. So let me take you back a step. What are blue carbon sinks, or what are blue carbon habitats? Just a quick question. Anyone knows what they are?
I've got a couple of them.
Okay. So they're basically natural habitats that take in carbon. And what differs them from green carbon sinks or terrestrial forests and terrestrial carbon sinks is that they store the carbon in their soils instead of releasing them back in the atmosphere at night. So that's why blue carbon sinks are quite important. In the UAE, like I said, in the UAE, these sinks are protected. But in Abu Dhabi, we've been working since 2012 with AGD, one of our partners or sister companies, that has worked solely on researching blue carbon in the region. And we've understand the effectiveness of these sinks in the UAE, be it mangroves, seagrass, sabkha, algal mats. So we've looked at all the blue carbon sinks that are important, and we've invested a lot of time and money in rehabilitating, planting, and also creating more carbon sinks. I think as of today, we can proudly say that we have, since that project, we have planted over 15 million mangroves in areas that needed rehabilitation. We have protected over 112 square kilometers of mangroves because of their importance as carbon sinks. And we're currently working on a seagrass restoration project because their importance as carbon sinks.
Right. Thank you. So, talking about the UAE, Marina, you've got a really interesting nature-based solutions project that you're implementing in the UAE. Can you tell us a bit more about it? Like, what's the approach? What are you trying to achieve?
Sure. And just to build on David's point, so that project we're implementing in the UAE is part of the Global Climate Solutions Partnership that HSBC has established with WWF and WRI. The project is implemented in partnership with the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi, Al Quwain government, the International Center of Biosaline Agriculture, and also recently we signed a strategic partnership with the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. So that's a multiple partnership effort. And of course, we're building on the previous work that EED has done in blue carbon as well over the past decade. So the project aims to look at nature-based solutions, the definition we offered earlier. So offer interventions that they bring us to nature conservation, natural ecosystems conservation on the ground. So it's not only about mangroves, it's not only about mangroves restoration or afforestation, it's to looking into those natural carbon sinks that they have been here for quite a while, and they have been sequestering carbon under the soil for decades. So the idea is to avoid further degradation of those ecosystems and avoid further emissions of GHG emissions in the atmosphere, essentially. We have identified 2 coastal lagoons in the UAE as priority sites to implement our interventions. One is in Abu Dhabi and the other one is in Al Quwain. And the idea is, obviously, we need to bring those measurable outcomes in GHG emission reductions, but also looking into the socioeconomic benefits that communities and businesses that operate in those coastal lagoons can generate for the future. One element that David mentioned earlier is that nature-based solutions at the moment typically receive philanthropic funding from corporates or typically funding from the public sector. And we have seen a major funding gap when it comes to nature-based solutions that we want to see at scale. So to bridge that gap, we need to bring private sector closer. So we need to have those public-private partnerships with more private sector financing going into nature-based solutions. So looking into commercial viability of what we're trying to achieve, linking it with ecotourism opportunities, protected areas, but through the business side of things, as well as food security and food innovation. These are some of the elements we want to explore as part of the project and build that commercial business case that can be more appealing for the private sector in the future and build those mechanisms for further financing. So that's our approach. So yeah,
Excellent.
if anybody wants to know a little bit more, we have more information on the website.
Great to know. Thank you, Marina. And actually, David, kind of, as you know, you've got the partnership here with WWF. I'd be curious to know, you know, what would cause a bank like your bank to invest in these solutions? What are the success factors you're looking for to make it scalable in the future?
I'm not sure a bank like us would commercially invest directly,
Okay.
but we can facilitate finance. That's, I think, our major role that we can play in this. How can we help the beneficiaries, the ultimate beneficiaries of those projects that are going to, again, benefit economically, not only from a natural perspective, but the actual economic value of those ecosystems. So those are the actors that can probably be the ones interested in raising funds, and we can help facilitate that activity through blue bonds, through green bonds, all of those mechanisms. So what we're trying to do with our projects is, it's interesting because I remember 2-3 years ago when we were actually developing and finding potential partners across the whole region, we struggled a lot because a lot of the proposals that we were getting, they were about planting 100 trees, like 1,000 trees, or just the focus was on the activity of planting trees itself. What we didn't want is just focus on that. We understand that, of course, we need to restore nature. That's an important part of all the nature-based solutions components and programs. But for us, the most important part was to actually understand what is the aggregated economic value of those ecosystems. It is relatively easy to understand what is the value of one mangrove tree or one forest specifically, but when you look at that aggregated value of the biomes or the ecosystem, the coastal lagoons that Marina was talking about, it is very different. And when you integrate as well the social aspects to the economical aspects, the value is much higher. Traditionally, we've been taking nature for granted and using nature without actually considering the value that it's bringing. And that created imbalances that actually took us to where we are today. So unless we really bring that externality, the value of that externality into our daily activities, our daily products, it's going to be very difficult to actually change how we do things and address climate change in the long term.
Excellent, thank you. And Muafaq, actually related to this point, it's easy obviously to quantify carbon and put a price on it through the voluntary markets, but obviously there's broader benefits, and David was hinting at that, and so was Marina. Not to mention, I guess, cultural benefits and intrinsic value of nature itself. But when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience offered by blue carbon habitats in particular, can you explain a bit more about that to us? What are the adaptation and resilience benefits that they offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So specifically when we're talking about this in the framework of the UAE, for example, we have a lot of studies that we've done on this particular topic. One of the main ones that I love to talk about as well is when we had released the State of Climate report back in the year 2021. This report essentially was just a synthesis of all the different modeling studies that had taken place in the region. So we're talking not just in the UAE, but also the surrounding region of the Arabian Peninsula, parts of Africa, and we were just trying to understand is this general region going to be impacted by climate change by the year 2050 and 2100. And some of the main findings that we had was that there's definitely going to be a noticeable increase in terms of sea level rise, which is going to increase a significant part of just the coastlines being eroded away back into the ocean. And some of the studies looked into just some of the potential that you could have when you're trying to implant certain roots into the region so they can try to prevent that soil from being taken away. But in addition to this, a lot of the work we're talking about when it comes to adaptation primarily comes from what you need to adapt against. When you recognize that different parts are more vulnerable than others, it gives you the opportunity to try to implant just the majority of your efforts in these particular regions, as these are the ones that are the sensitive zones. This report that we're talking about in particular as well, and you can find this online, it's readily available on just the ministry's website. It gives you a very strong synopsis of the fact that a lot of the ecosystems in that area are now vulnerable. They're vulnerable for multiple reasons. It's not just because sea level rise is changing the topography of the region. In addition to this, we have an increase in temperature of the water, a change in ocean acidification, an increase in the salinity, and this also links back to industrial practices. A lot of the work shows that there's going to be an increase in salinity from just desalination practices. Our groundwater reserves are going to be impacted as well. The ideal situation here is that by using nature-based solutions, instead of using just natural or let's say artificial means, such as berms and wave breakers, is the fact that not only do you prevent that erosion from taking place, but you provide an entirely new ecosystem that can protect the current ecosystem from all these changes. We recognize that the increase in mangrove activity, salt marshes and so on also help maintain the soil properties. They maintain the water properties very well. There's a buffer system that's in place. So the main idea here is that we need to identify what can survive in that region, what is likely to be able to tolerate just the new temperatures, and what is the thermal capacity that we can try to teach these different ecosystems to be able to adapt to in order for us to be able to implant just that new set of ecosystems in that new region. And one last thing I want to highlight here as well, and this ties in a little bit with what the IPCC had mentioned before. The Arabian Gulf in and of itself is somewhat of a niche case in comparison with the rest of the regions of the world. They look at it almost like a case study for what climate change would look like relative to the planet. The idea here is that any strategies that we employ just in the Arabian Gulf is a very strong case for what we're likely to witness in the rest of the planet. Meaning anything that succeeds is something that they can try to make use of. So it's our added responsibility to try our best to push forward and pioneer new techniques and new technology to make this happen. But as of this point in time, we recognize that nature-based solutions stands as one of the best options that we have available. And we know the UAE is already working towards this, as they had not only announced a 30 million mangrove plan originally, but have also upscaled that now to 100 million mangroves by the year 2030 and pushed up to 2050 as well. So just putting this perspective, you can really see just some of the benefits that are going to be coming from this type of approach.
Actually, you raised a lot of points there. Actually, David, you have something to say on that.
Sorry, I'm just jumping the queue here. But
that's fine.
I just wanted to comment on one tangible example of what you just said, because it's really good that we are looking at those ecosystems from a macro perspective and what are the risks of small island that are going to suffer the consequence of climate change. But even from a finance perspective, we are already starting to look at that. I just saw recently an internal document on that we are evaluating what is our exposure to potential sea level rises in Dubai for our mortgage portfolio across the city. So where are we lending to individuals that they have a house in a higher exposed area? That probably in the future would be linked to a higher risk and hence a higher price or interest rate, because it is a higher possibility of becoming a stranded asset for us, or maybe the need to link it to some kind of insurance policy that's going to underwrite the risk of actually having that product with that client. So this is something that is coming. It's not only us, obviously, that's doing that. All of the financial institutions are looking at this. At some point, the climate risk is going to be integrated in the pricing of lending from banks. So that's going to cost us money at the end as well.
So we can expect higher mortgage rates for property on the coast. Sorry. Anyway, I'm only joking. I'm sure it might not be the case. We have to see how it all plays out. But good. All right. You raised some really important points there. And actually, I want to go back to this point about socioeconomic benefits, Matha, because we've been talking around that a little bit. But there has been some work done in Abu Dhabi on this. And so what are the key economic activities in Abu Dhabi and the UAE that rely on these ecosystems?
So, as Marina mentioned, we're working on a project to highlight exactly these socioeconomic benefits that come out of natural-based solutions and natural habitats overall. And like Muwafaq talked about, touched a few points of the importance of these habitats to ensure the soil is not eroded. It's like a first line of protection for our coasts. And David added that there's going to be an increase in mortgage.
He didn't. I said that. I said that, not him. Yeah.
So that all plays in the socio-economic benefits of these habitats. These habitats, and I might disagree with David on having to put a price on these habitats, because anything you put a price on can be bought, and that's nothing we don't want to see happening. So in the UAE in specific, natural-based solutions or these natural habitats are quite important, not just for blue carbon, we've got that covered. It's important for food security. That's quite a very important source of food security. For those who don't know where Abu Dhabi is basically an island, and our main source of protein is fish. So these habitats are quite important for our local fisheries. A very important note, our fisheries are artisanal, not big scale. So even in our fisheries practice, we try to limit impact on these habitats by keeping it small scale, artisanal, just enough fish caught, not to be exploiting our stocks. So there's nothing really I can add much because the guys covered most of the things.
Okay.
It's just that the other thing that these ecosystems provide is ecotourism. People have this notion that we live in a desert. So I promise if you come to the UAE, you'll see something different. The mangroves play a very important role in ecotourism. Corals, some of our corals play a very important ecotourism. We have a lot of nice dive sites that people like to join and go out to. But from our perspective, the most important benefit is the solutions these habitats give us to combat climate change. Today, I'm talking about today, this is one of the most important benefits we get.
Excellent. Thank you, Meta. And you highlighted some really crucial points there about the benefits and actually, Marina, it makes me think. You've been your background is conservation. You've been working on this topic for a long time. What do you see are the key challenges and the opportunities to scale and strengthen the integrity of nature-based solutions? Yeah.
A lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities,
Okay.
right? So in terms of challenges, I'd say that one thing that we're seeing around the world is there's a lot of focus on afforestation. And if these type of initiatives are not being designed or implemented properly, it might not bring the outcomes that these projects intend to have. So we've seen around the world actually monoculture plantations and forests that actually have a negative environmental impact. So these type of projects need to be designed properly, and they need to be embedded in science and embedded with evidence. So what we believe is very important is to have a strong baseline from an ecological point of view to look at what is the ecological status in the area you're working on, number one. Make the problem have a problem statement, if you like. Define what is the societal challenge that you need to address through nature and have it very clear and clearly articulated. And based on this baseline, build a monitoring program, short and long term, to be able to demonstrate what is the achievable outcomes that you bring, right? And back to the point of bringing also private sector and investors are asking hard questions when it comes to impact. So yes, making the business case is quite challenging for us as well from a conservation perspective. But letting them know and making sure we have hard data on what is the actual impact on the ground is super important for the private sector investors as well. So it's not only because we want to make change, but it's also how do we speak to stakeholders and how do we essentially bring up those issues. So a second challenge I would say is to the investor's point of view, we have been debating quite a lot in terms of it's quite challenging to make the business case. A lot of elements of nature-based solutions are innovative, so it takes time, and we need to talk at a scale that investors can understand. So there is that debate within the ecosystem of stakeholders for talking about nature-based solutions. So I believe that level of innovation is important. We need to start looking into mechanisms that it could be beyond carbon markets, it could be non-market related incentives for the private sector to come in, and then start looking how do we leverage of philanthropic funding and public funding and bring the private sector in. So I would say these are two main points that I'd like to make.
Excellent. And a lot of relevant points regarding what's happening in the COP around us. There's debates about finalizing Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and the financing really fits within that context here. So really insightful remarks. I could go on for ages, but I do appreciate we've got a full audience, so I want to hear from the audience as well. I'd like to ask a question first from a female, if possible, in the audience, because actually there's a lot of evidence that shows when a lady asks a question, then more ladies feel comfortable asking questions after them. So do we have any questions from women in the audience today first, to have the first question? Okay, the lady over there in the middle, their hand up. If you could introduce yourself and who you're representing, please, and keep the questions short if possible.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm Kelly Wanzer. I'm the executive director of Silver Lining. My NGO is focused on near-term climate risk, and we're very interested in advancing research and information on what natural systems are, how they're affected, and what that means for the 30 or 40-year time horizon risk when the Earth is projected to continue to warm. And so I was very interested in your comments. Firstly, thank you for an extraordinary session and for your work on these topics and your orientation towards sharing your findings with the world about the sort of effects and the rugged conditions in your region. But I was interested, the work that you described, Muwafaq, implies a lot of information and science to understand, the resiliency of these different nature-based solutions and the vulnerability of the different systems. So I wondered if you could just talk about that aspect of the information science that you need to do this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really good question, actually, because it really highlights just what those lessons learned can be and how everybody can try to incorporate it for themselves. I think we have a relatively unique approach that we're trying to make use of in the UAE as well, and it's something that gives us the opportunity to learn a little bit more about that very specific area. So I currently work as part of the support team for a network known as the Climate Change Research Network, and in that network it's broken down to 5 clusters, but one of those clusters specifically is climate change, terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems. They work very heavily to gather as many researchers as they can from the UAE who have a stake in the form of climate change that work within that field. And they work as a combined unit, pooling their resources together, their data, their expertise, to try to understand just how they can tackle different research problems in that area. And the whole goal of that network as well is to align with policymakers to make sure that the work that they're doing is actioned directly through them. So the idea to say here is that by taking these researchers who have a very strong understanding of how these ecosystems are actually working together, how they function, and then to actually do experiments and tests within the soil and within these different implementation areas, just to see what the lessons learned can be. Can we action this? Can we improve it? And on top of that, can we teach it to the policymakers to make sure that they can then bring in the funding that's necessary to try to turn this into a large-scale executional plan? So that's the primary way that we're doing this. But of course, on top of that, there are generally overarching research efforts that are taking place. We're talking about people who are looking towards other regions nearby that have similar conditions and trying to bring that back to the UAE. So it works both ways. There's internal research that's taking place, but in addition, we're trying to look externally to see if we can get some support from everybody around us. The work that's done by the research network is also public information, and everything is always going to be available on their webpage, in addition to the State of Climate report that I mentioned earlier, which is also on that webpage. That type of information will always be available to anybody who could make use of it, and the data is also public access. So therefore, anybody who has anything to do with the Arabian Gulf should also have open access to the information there, so long as we have that option. And we're looking forward to hopefully trying to expand this network in the future as well to just increase our expertise, the youth's inclusion, and just trying to really buckle down on the nature-based solutions that we can try to employ.
Great, thank you. Excellent. We have more questions. Wow, a lot of hands. Okay. If we could have, that gentleman with, he's been waiting, and then we can take 3 at a time if possible. Is that okay? Yeah, so if you start first with your question, and then I'd like to give it to the lady at the front.
Sure. Hi there. My name is Mark Tilley. I'm a journalist with Carbon Pulse. I was just wondering if the panel could comment on the announcement yesterday that a UAE-based company called Blue Carbon was going to regulate the entire carbon framework of Papua New Guinea. And there was a government announcement for that yesterday. And so I was just wondering if the panel could make reflections on those announcements and what the implications could possibly be.
I'm seeing some shaking heads, but you are in the UAE pavilion. So is there anyone from the government here who could help answer that question for him? Maybe you can take it one-to-one. Yeah. Or, okay. Okay, so we're not aware of it. So I think maybe Meta has kindly offered to connect you with someone from the ministry on that. So maybe after the event you can exchange numbers. Yeah, thank you. The lady at the front here, who was waiting patiently, plus we have quite a few
Hi,
others. in the
hello.
chat.
Very wonderful discussion. Raja Haboubi from Blockchain and Climate Institute. I just wanted, actually, it ties back to the question that the gentleman in the back raised. But how do you see the UAE's role in, with this type of initiative, implementing other projects or backing other projects in more vulnerable sites around the world, in Africa, in Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean, because it's really hard to get financing into those places, at least private finance for the moment. And what do you think is the potential for establishing carbon credit market in the UAE specifically, and then perhaps expanding on that experience for other regions?
Sure. So, and we have room for one more question at the back. The gentleman there has been waiting. So, I've got notes of the questions. Go on.
My name is Sam Teicher. I'm the co-founder of Coral Vita, and we're a company that grows corals to restore dying reefs. Had the pleasure of being in the UAE actually in February for the World Expo and the Earthshot Prize. And my question is, as someone whose job is coral reef restoration, and we're very excited about opportunities to restore reefs in the UAE, how encouraged are you also by terrestrial, in particular, efforts to preserve reefs to begin with? Because I'll be the first one to say we shouldn't even need to restore them. So exploring nature-based solutions, but also mitigating a lot of the impacts that end up in the water so that the reefs and other marine ecosystems are healthier to begin with.
Okay. So, two questions. The first one was about financing the use of carbon credits. Who'd like to take that from the audience? Marina, maybe, or? And
I'm not it's the financing in general and the carbon markets,
yeah,
I
use
believe?
of carbon markets to establish a carbon market in the UAE to finance these solutions.
I cannot speak for the
Okay.
UAE in general. I can say that yes, carbon markets has been one of the mechanisms that has been encouraging companies to invest in nature-based solutions for offsetting. I would say that also there is a stream of discussions to look at non-market-based also investments. And if you look at the Science-Based Target Initiative, they recently published the Net Zero Standard, that essentially what they're saying is companies should be encouraged to invest in nature-based solutions projects on the ground, that they are targeting emission reductions beyond the value chain. So I think there's other mechanisms for private sector to contribute to these type of projects for the bigger ambition, if you like. But I cannot comment on the.
Sure.
I'm sure
Moffat,
if
did you
somebody
have
wants
something
to
to
talk about
say?
the UAE.
Yep.
I'm actually also happy to talk just a bit about the coral as well. And we're talking a little bit about coral
Right.
restoration and just sort of the impact of that and how we can maybe try to, as you mentioned, mitigate just even the need for having some coral restoration projects. I think the two notes we have to make here is coral restoration is of course something that we're going to have to do now because we're already seeing visible impacts of the fact that we are losing some of our coral diversity. But also in the midst of doing this type of research, they've identified that not all coral tend to operate equally. We found that some are a lot more temperature resilient, so they can stand the thermal implications of climate change, at least in this particular region. But one important thing that we also found is that the coral in our region happens to be more thermally tolerant than very similar coral, or very similar genetics in other regions, and this is primarily due to exposure. This led to just a general bit of work that's currently undertaken where they're trying their very best to see if they can try to tailor the coral that we have right now, just through thermal experiments, to see if we can try to make them more adaptive to this. There was generally a marine heat wave that had hit the UAE back in the year 2002, and 3 different types of coral were investigated in this time frame. And one of the main things that they identified was the coral genus that bleached first, the first time that heat wave had arrived, during another heat wave 2 years later, happened to be the last piece of coral that bleached. And they found that just this one bleaching event that it was able to recover from gave it the thermal tolerance to be able to adapt in the future. Now, unfortunately, because climate change tends to happen on a quite a large scale, and the only way for us to try to preserve them without having to try to restore them is to try to limit the implications that we have right now, being that can be ocean acidification and also just the thermal increase in temperature. But the main thing that we can do here is just try to increase our mitigative efforts to the best of our ability to try to reduce that impact. And then from there, try our very best to help the coral adapt to what they have at the moment until we can try to get the situation under control. From that point forward, we should be able to try to see if we can maybe just maintain and just have a protection program and mechanism so that they would not have to undergo any more of these types of experiments. But further to this, I think that if we just focus on both our current restoration and our future plans to try to prevent the loss of the coral's biodiversity, we would generally be in a relatively okay position by the time we hit 2050.
Right. Thank you. I'm being given the signal that we're running out of time, or we are out. But we did start a bit late. Helen, can we have a couple more minutes? Okay, yeah? Thank you. So we have a gentleman there, if you could introduce yourself, and the lady there who's been very patiently waiting with the lovely earrings. So, very noticeable.
Hello,
Yeah.
my name is Vahid Fatuhi with Blue Forest, which is a UAE-based mangrove reforestation and conservation specialist. This question is addressed to Maitha and Marina. Marina, you mentioned that reforestation and afforestation is very risky and could have actually a negative impact on us. And I just wanted to see from Maitha, you mentioned that since 2012 you have been running an R&D center and learning about best practices. What are some of the things that EAD has learned in terms of conducting best-in-class reforestation and afforestation in mangroves?
Right.
Thank
That's
you
question
for the
one.
question.
Then the second question
We're taking
is the lady over
batches.
there. And that's the last one, apologies, because we have to stop after that.
My name is Tarhas Hagos. I work with Nature Tropical. It's an NGO based in Benin for quite some time, and they have been doing a lot of work on marine conservation and all this. And from my observation and experience, I had found out that the role of training youth in this sector is so crucial, and I wanted to know what you're doing regarding this. And on because I'm an international, do you partner with other organizations that are doing the same kind of thing? Yeah.
Sure. Excellent. So that question was about training youth. The first question was about lessons learned from afforestation. So you'd like to take Marina?
So I can start and then pass
Yeah?
it off to
Okay.
Michael. So essentially what I was trying to say is that this type of projects need to be designed carefully. And as I mentioned earlier, it needs to be based on science. So this type of afforestation or restoration activities sometimes favor one habitat over the other, and all habitats are equally important. So essentially, we just don't want to see, mangroves be favored over mudflats that they have very important ecological features, but also economic activities related to seagrasses. So we want to see a bit more of a holistic approach in terms of restoration in general. One point as well to make is that let's not forget the natural carbon sinks that are already there, because degradation of those release emissions back into the atmosphere. So it makes also economic sense to invest on what is already there. And what was the next question, sorry? The youth. So that's kind of the point about the afforestation and restoration efforts. On the youth from our side, and I'll pass it on to Maitha, we are a civil society environmental NGO based in the UAE. So youth is a very important segment of the population that we're engaging with very actively. We have been running a number of programs together with the ED as well, and we are essentially inviting youth to come with us on the ground to help us in what we're doing. So definitely we're looking into partnerships as well.
I'll try to be quick. Lessons learned. Marina touched on a lot of them. One of the most important things we've learned is that we have to keep in mind the other ecosystems around mangroves and not to favor mangroves or any other ecosystem we are restoring over another. Mudflats are quite important, although they are prime mangrove areas. So, and when it comes to being effective carbon sinks, the more appropriate the land is for mangrove plantation, the less human intervention it needs, the better sink it is. And also from what we've learned is that natural mangroves are more effective as carbon sinks than planted mangroves. That's the lessons learned. With the youth, we actually have a lot of youth programs. If you've been attending, we had 2 youth events I think here in the UAE Pavilion that are related to EAD. We also have something called sustainable schools, sustainable campuses. We have a whole section that only focuses on the youth. And I don't know if any of the youth are left here, but I'll definitely connect you with them. We also have something called Green Youth Majlis. A majlis is basically an area where everyone comes together. It's a very traditional setting in the Arabian Gulf that's used throughout the countries in the Arabian Gulf. So we have the Green Youth Majlis, which also has a lot of interaction with the youth. And about the corals, I will have to sit down with you because I have a lot.
Yeah, excellent. Look, I can see the panelists are really eager to continue, but we do have to draw a line under it now, I'm afraid. As you can see, this is a really rich topic. You know, we could talk about it for a long time, and you know, I hope those who are coming to COP28 in Dubai are tempted to come because of all this lovely habitats that exist there. You will be able to experience that. I've personally been living in Dubai for 15 years, and it gives you a sense of calm going into the mangrove areas. So if you want to escape the COP kind of circus, it's nice to have a bit of downtime. It's a lovely place to be. So with that, I'd like to close the panel and thank everyone and show our appreciation, please. Thank you. Exchange your details with them. Yeah. Thank you.